All right, so I come to the next section, and that section is possibly a little surprising. Speaking about F53's connection to Popper's philosophy. Of course, we are all Popper experts by now, because we had a session here on Popper and economics. And of course, there is, if you read the paper, Popper is nowhere cited. So why should there be a connection to Popper's philosophy in F53? Well, if you look at the literature, Friedman never cites Popper in F53. Its connection to Popper's philosophy are well known in the literature. So everyone knows there is some sort of Popper influence. And one author even claimed, but this is controversial, I cited that also in my paper on Friedman and sent it somewhere, and then I got an angry comment by the referee, said, oh, that's nonsense what this author writes. So this author Kepler, who is not extremely well known, he writes, the methodology of positive economics established falsificationism as the dominant methodology in economic research as far as the self-perception of academic economists was concerned. That he claimed in 1998. So he thinks that was really, Popper was all over in economics, and that's probably, he saw that in his colleagues. So he must have been somehow short-sighted, because others said, no, that's not true at all. We never cared about Popper, and that's unimportant. Anyway, this is much too strong. But there are indeed various elements in F53 apparently taken directly out of Popper's work from 35 and then published in English in 1959, The Logic of Scientific Discovery. So this is Popper's seen as Popper's main work, and I just give you a short list of topics, because Popper is nowhere cited. But if you look at them and have Popper in the back of your mind, you see immediately these are Popper topics, right, so to speak. So, and in comparison, if you know, there you have to know, of course, more of the history of philosophy of science. So if you look at philosophy of science of the 20th century, and then you find these statements about, which are general philosophical statements, and then you find where is a philosophical author whom I could, blame or honor with these statements, then it's obvious these are really Popper topics. So none of these other people really press them in that way. And then if you have the aggregated picture there, it's really very Popperian. So for instance, theory testing by predictions leads to tentative acceptance or rejection. This is exactly what Popper says, right? You can really have that in Popper. And this is what Friedman says there on page 8 to 9 or something. Evidence for a hypothesis is repeated failure to contradict it. And this is 100% Popper. That one before, you may say, oh, that may be also someone else, but this is evidence for the hypothesis is repeated failure to contradict it. So it means that everyone tries to contradict a hypothesis, meaning try to falsify it, and the positive is only all you can say positively about a hypothesis, that repeated failure to contradict it. So this is 100% Popper. He can't have it anywhere apart from his own mind, but otherwise that sounds perfectly like Popper. And then here, again, very, very, very Popperian. General theory must have implication susceptible to empirical contradiction. This is the demarcation criterion, right, of Popper. This is exactly the demarcation criterion. Something is only scientific if and only if it has implications that may be empirically falsified. This is exactly what he's saying. Empirical contradiction is falsification, of course. Then again, this is very, very Popperian. Science is a body of tentatively accepted generalizations. This is really where Popper is. I think I didn't mention it in my exposition of Popper. This is where Popper was the first one of the more famous philosophers of science who stressed that science has never ultimate truths. Empirical science, never ever. This was, of course, the idea both in antiquity, in science of Aristotle and in Plato and so on, but also in early modern science, including then induction that was introduced. But the idea was that even by induction, we get the final truth. So until the end of end of the 19th century, physicists were convinced that the Newtonian theory, that what is called classical physics today, is the final word on the matter. It cannot be falsified. It's just the truth about the universe. And then physicists discovered in the beginning of the 20th century, beginning of course earlier, but then in the 21st quarter of the 20th century, people discovered, well, that is not true about classical mechanics. There are other theories that really somehow supersede classical mechanics. That was special relativity, general relativity, and quantum mechanics, and they showed the firm belief in the truth of classical physics was false. And physicists have ever been healed from beliefs in the fixity. So physicists are typically very skeptical also about today's physics. Other disciplines are not so skeptical. So if you talk to biologists, some of them think that evolutionary theory is a truth forever. Right? Just forever. Needs perhaps little adjustment, but it's a truth forever. Physicists don't say that anymore because they had the shock of their life, well, their disciplinary shock of physics life. So they don't believe it. And Popper was the first one, surprisingly, of the prominent philosophers who really stated that then, and said when he spoke in general about science, look, science is a body of tentatively accepted generalizations. Tentatively, well, you try to falsify them. So far, you weren't successful in the falsification, so they have survived, but you don't know what's coming tomorrow, right? A new test, and then it may be falsified. So Popper is really, and this is really something really important, that Popper as the first philosopher then, well, there may be others, but the first famous one, who stressed that. And this is an important insight, which is now, of course, absolutely common ground in philosophy of science. Everyone believes that. So then what he says, what Friedman says, a fundamental methodological principle is a hypothesis can only be tested by its implications. That's, of course, in Popper, but that is much earlier already in the 19th century in John Stuart Mill. Right? Mill is also an economist, an important one. So this is not particularly Popperian, but it's also in Popper, and it's plausible that Friedman has it somehow from Popper. So it's only tested by its implication. This is, of course, what people take from Friedman, not asking, what is inside the hypothesis, what are the building blocks, and then people having this false idea of instrumentalism. Well, I come back to instrumentalism. Then any theory is necessarily provisional. That's the same as a body of tentatively accepted generalizations, but this is also completely Popperian sound that you hear there. And then the construction of hypotheses must be discussed in psychological, not logical categories. This you find explicitly on page, I don't know what it is, 15, on the logic of scientific discovery, completely Popperian topic. You find it also in other authors, but Popper was really, and Reichenbach is another one, but you find it in Popper, and Popper was earlier than the others, although he's mostly not credited for that. But this is really in Popper, and this is in Popper speaks explicitly about psychology there, in contrast to logical categories, and this he takes there. And that there you see, by the way, the construction of hypotheses is, of course, something where you use ideal types, right? You have a certain situation, so you look at the cigarette market before the Second World War, and then you try to understand what's happening there, and then this shock comes or that shock comes, and then you think, what sort of ideal types could I use here? And then you come up, okay, let's use the ideal types, perfect monopoly and perfect competition. And when you ask, how did the scientists come to this idea? Well, you're asking a psychological question. Right? And it's not the question, but the question then, the epistemological question, whether that's a good hypothesis, is decided somewhere else. According to Friedman, of course, derive empirically testable conclusions from this hypothesis that you can treat it, say, as a perfectly competitive market, and then look whether they agree with empirical data or not, right? So this is completely Popperian. So if you look at that, you say, that guy has somehow read Popper, right, and took it out from there. Now, of course, there's a historical puzzle that doesn't work, because F53, as its name so clearly signals, appeared in 1953. You've probably noticed that F53, that corresponds to 1953, although one has to have some intelligence because the 19 is missing, okay? Anyway, so, and Popper's English edition of his book appeared in 1959, so 6 years later after 53. The original German edition was out, appeared in 1934, but Friedman did not read German. So how is that possible? So very strange. I mean, there are other, Popper has other publications, but in these other publications up to 1959, these themes and topics from the logic of scientific discovery are not covered. In later publication, you find lots of it, right? In other books, Objective Knowledge and whatnot, you find it there. So there's a historic puzzle, how can that be? And then you may say, well, he neither cites. You may, so at first sight, you can say, well, that's nonsense, what people are saying here, Popper, you know. He neither cites Popper, and the book of Popper appears in 59 in English, so that must be nonsense. Well, one can follow that up. And there is a solution in an interview with Friedman in 1992, and that was put on the web in 2012. And there Friedman explains in the interview, one of the major benefits that I personally derived from the first meeting of the Mont Pelerin Society in 1947. You may know of the Mont Pelerin Society, it still exists. Hayek has founded it, and these were liberal economists. They founded it in 47, you know, as an answer then to the Second World War and its consequences, and communism and so on. And then you had, of course, socialism and communistic ideas also in the Western world. And here were the liberal, Hayek was there, and many other important people were there, and Popper was there, and Friedman was there, and Stigler was there, and Hayek was there. So this was really a bunch of important people. You can look it up. The society still exists, but certainly not with that influence. Anyway, so he personally derived from the first meeting of the Mont Pelerin Society was that meeting Karl Popper, and having an opportunity for some long discussions with him. Not on economic policy at all, which was, of course, the main topic of these meetings of the society at that time, but on methodology in the social sciences and in the physical sciences. So both on social sciences and physical sciences. By that time, Popper also got interested in the social sciences, and he later wrote then, I think in the 60s, essays on the methodology of the social sciences. So Popper was there on the move. And Friedman and him, they talked about that. That conversation played a non-negligible role in a later essay of mine, The Methodology of Positive Economics. So that was in 47, right? There were no English writings available to Friedman, and then he just remembered what Popper said and put it in his, and he explains it here, right? It's in the paper, no doubt, but you don't find a trace. Right? No Popper citation, nothing, not even an acknowledgement, right? You could have seen acknowledgement. I thank my teacher, Frank Knight, for introducing me to Max Weber, and I thank Karl Popper for having this wonderful discussion in 47, which influenced me, blah, blah, blah. It would have been much easier. But he doesn't say a word. Well, you may like it or may not like it, but anyway, so therefore you don't find it, but it's absolutely clear that this is not just a fever fantasy of people that they say there is Popper in there, and to a significant part, but the Popper part is less important than the Weber part. But let's see, why is Popper important? And there I'm asking therefore then now not the historical question, but the systematic question. Why was Popper's philosophy important to Friedman? Why is that? Why does he admit that in this interview? What is the significance of that? And there's a superficial answer, and that's the normal answer that's given in the literature by people who say what's going on here, and the superficial answer, which is perfectly plausible, and you don't see that this is superficial. F53 tries to assimilate economics to physics, right? You saw that in the first pages of the paper, where I say, yeah, economics can be as good as physics. And it's only, a quantitative difference somehow. And Popper's philosophy is meant to be a philosophy of physics. If you read the Logic of Scientific Discovery, Popper is absolutely explicit. He says, my model of a natural science is theoretical physics. Absolutely clear. So this was, of course, part of the success of Popper. So all the disciplines that thought, oh, my discipline, be it political science or be it sociology, they, we are not really making progress. Oh, these physicists making progress all the time, building such nice devices like atomic bombs and transistors and whatnot and iPhones. Also. Anyway, So let's be like physics. And then they say, yeah, but we can't read Einstein and real physics. So, but Popper is readable, right? So, and he says he's describing physics. Wonderful. So we take Popper on board. And this is part of really Popper's very large success. Not everywhere, less in the United States, but much in England, in the UK, and also in Germany, and in economics, and as I told you earlier. Okay, so this is the superficial answer, but you may say, yeah, that's fine. Wonderful. Yeah, sure. That's good enough as an answer. Why is Friedman fond of Popper? But I think there is a much more profound answer, and it's this. Now, if you take seriously what I explained to you about ideal types and all of that, the introduction of ideal types in order to formulate hypotheses for some type of economic situation is not empirically controlled, right? And Friedman knows that, as Weber knows it. So you are familiar, you know what the cigarette industry was doing over 20 years, right, in the United States, and then you observe what happens when the government does certain tax rules or price caps or whatever. And then you say, oh, that's interesting. And you are familiar with that, right? You are an economist who knows these situations, who has analyzed it, has many data. And then you say, come on, how can we analyze that now in more theoretical terms? And then you say, whoa, wow, look at that. That could work by using just, the two ideal types, perfect competition, and for the other situation, monopolistic competition, no competition, right? Monopoly. And this is, of course, when you ask, what's the justification for that? I said, look, I'm just familiar with that situation. That's an idea that crossed my mind. It's a hypothesis. And now the next step is then, this is not empirically controlled in any sense. Of course, if you are good, then you hit, right? If you're a bad economist, you say, oh, I don't understand it. But there is no perfect competition. But a very sharp-minded economist may say, look, the fundamental factor is this. Now let's analyze it in these terms. But it's highly hypothetical, even that's speculative, right? You make the speculation that by analyzing the situation in terms of perfect competition, that might be a good hypothesis. But that's a speculation, not more than that. And therefore, this sort of methodology, by working by ideal types, you need strong empirical control. Clearly so. If you are a self-critical scientist, you see that. I'm working very speculatively here, and therefore I need strong empirical control. And then Popper tells him also, look, you can analyze this act of creation of this hypothesis, which ideal types you construct or use there. This is just, intuitive and psychological, and I can perhaps, if I want to analyze it in psychological terms. But it's not very interesting, at least not for a scientist or for a philosopher, but you want to know, how does it work? How is now this hypothesis that's empirically badly controlled, how is it now controlled such that we can say, yes, we can trust this hypothesis. We need empirical confirmation, or at least missing disconfirmation, and that's exactly what Popper's philosophy creates. And Popper was the first one who saw that the creation of in philosophy of science, physicists of course saw that earlier, but Popper was the first one who then expressed that in philosophy, saying, look, the creation of wild and strange and exotic hypotheses scientists are very free there. They can construct what they want, right? The only thing is they must be falsifiable, and then they must try to falsify it, right? This is so the big freedom that scientists get in Popper's philosophy, in contrast to inductivism. Because in inductivism, you are a slave of your data, right? You have the data, and then you say, I have to generalize from the data to the hypothesis. But in Popper, he said, which is, of course, historically much more adequate, what Popper is saying, at least for the science of the 19th and the 20th and the 22nd century, scientists are very free to dream up hypotheses. The main point is, this is only a dream, it's speculative, and then you have to control it, right? And you control it by deriving empirical consequences and then testing whether the empirical consequences apply. And this is exactly where Popper is giving Friedman's intuitions, Friedman's ideas about ideal types, what he learned from Max Weber finally, but via Knight, and which he applied then and wrote down in his paper. So Popper is extremely helpful for him. All right. So this is the Popper part. Again, this is a little short here. It's if you want to read something, I've developed it a little in more detail in my paper. That's one of the supplementary papers. And